Department of Homeland Security. Mike Letman is the Cybersecurity Advisor for DHS Region 9. The mission of Cybersecurity Advisors is to provide direct coordination, outreach, and regional support in order to protect cyber components essential to the sustainability, preparedness, and protection of the nation's critical infrastructure and key resources and state, local, tribal, and territorial governments. Mike has served in several capacities on many cyber and security teams, task forces, and committees over his career. He currently sits as the Governor's Arizona Cyber Team, ACT, and is a member of the Arizona Counterterrorism Information Center and a member of the State of Arizona's Cyber Disruption Planning Group. Mike was the Chief Information Security Officer for the State of Arizona for 6 years and the CISO for the State of Wisconsin for 8 years. He supported many high-level events such as the Super Bowl, state elections, and inaugurations. Mike has planned, organized, and successfully completed multiple cyber exercises in both states involving government entities, critical infrastructure, private sector companies, and the National Guard. Mike will introduce the members of today's cybersecurity panel.
Thank you very much. First of all, I want to thank all of you for coming out today. We're in a kind of a situation of kind of fear, exaggeration, uncertainty, and people taking extreme measures. And I just want to say, number one, I want to thank the organizers of this event. You did a great job. They gave us information on, how to use common sense, how to keep ourselves protected, and that's good. We can't take our economy by all hiding in caves and stuff like that. But we have to use common sense as we're going out. So I thank all of you for coming in. And again, thank you for the event organizers and the event sponsors for this. So with that, I'm going to have each of these guys introduce themselves and give a little bit on their backgrounds as well. So let's start out. Dave, why don't you go ahead? I'm going to pull this if I can.
All right. Good morning, everybody. I'm Dave Nichols. I am a 26-year retired Coast Guard captain. Upon leaving the Coast Guard in 2015, I started my own independent consulting company. Did that for 3 years and currently work for American Bureau of Shipping here in Houston with responsibilities of providing cybersecurity services for ports and terminals.
Hello, I'm Rick Teen with Mission Secure Incorporated, and we are a company that focuses on operational technology cybersecurity as almost exclusively. Of course, we have IT cyber experience, but we really see the gap and the need in the marketplace for focusing on that OT because it really has to be handled differently. So that's our area of focus, and that's what I'll be talking about today.
Thank you. Ryder Washburn. I'm at the START Center, which stands for the National Consortium for the Study of Terrorism and Responses to Terrorism. We're placed at the University of Maryland, College Park. I am there as the cyber intelligence researcher for the center. And my operational areas include, ICS, but also threats from ICS in the IT field. And that's kind of where I'm coming from. But prior to that, I worked as a threat intelligence analyst at FireEye, and I was in consulting at PwC for cyber threat operations for PwC USA.
All right, thank you guys. So you kind of heard my long background. At the end, I'm going to talk a little bit about DHS and what we can do for the critical infrastructure. Everything from DHS for the critical infrastructure is at no cost to you, or as my colleague from Minnesota likes to say, as of April 15th, you've already paid for those services. So, and yes, I was from Wisconsin, and yes, I have been to Packer games at 10 below. So, and it's kind of, and now I'm in Phoenix at 120. So, go figure. Also, I just want to say that your security advisor, your cybersecurity advisor here in Texas, or the Southern Texas, is George Reeves. I'm sitting in for George. He's at another event, so that's why I'm here. But if you ping me, I'll hook you up with George. I'll virtually introduce you, so not a problem. George is a great guy, too. So I'm going to start out a little at the end. I'm going to ask you guys for questions from this panel, kind of what I call stump the panel. And so start thinking about questions to ask. I'm going to start out with my favorite question that I like to ask people, especially in this industry. As you know, I got a long cyber background, so and also working with emergency management. So I'm going to ask each of you in the panel, and I'll start with you, Dave, What is the worst thing a bad actor could do with cyber that would affect ports, and how? Or, another way to say it, if you could use cyber to attack ports, what's the worst thing you could do?
Right. So, I mean, it's a great question in the sense that cyber, I think, presents a very unique opportunity for a bad actor in the sense that if you think about terminal operations, the biggest concern in the past has always been, physical security, that in a lot of ways, when you think about it, it's probably a one and done. Somebody's going to come in, they're going to take some sort of activity, whether it's an explosion or whatever, it's going to be finite. The whole purpose, I think, in a lot of ways for the bad actors we're seeing, certainly in the world of ransomware, is you want your attack to be persistent. You want it to be as painful as possible. There's some terminals here in the Houston ship channel that will tell you if they told you the price of a service disruption for 1 hour, it would probably surprise you how much money that is. So the real threat is a bad actor shutting you down, causing a service disruption that the intent is to keep you shut down for as long as possible, to make it as painful as possible so you'll pay as much money as possible to let them turn back on your operations. And then also I would say, I think it often gets overlooked that it's also a tremendous safety issue on the cyber front. If I were to do something that created a overheat, over pressurized, over whatever, I could actually hurt a lot of people. So, I would encourage too for HSSE, the safety folks and everything, they need to have awareness of this as well. I view that as a very serious threat.
Thank you, sir. Rick?
Well, I'll talk mainly about the operation. That's a great answer. I'll talk mainly about the operational stuff. Obviously, there are all the IT threats you can imagine someone could do with any network, but those exist also in the operational networks, and the ability to lock people out and ransom and things like that, shut down the operation, are all very serious. Really, from an OT point of view, you need to be thinking both about the operational technology being a way in to your overall network, but also could be the point of impact, where you're actually changing the behavior of your cranes and transfer equipment and things like that could also be very dangerous and create a safety issue. So you want to think about the full run of possibilities there. And we hear all sorts of crazy things. I heard a story at London Shipping Week about a port issue where there was a hack in order to simply hide a container that had drugs in it, and the hackers basically just wanted to make sure that they got that container moved to where they would be the only ones who knew where that container was apparently the motivation behind the hack. So there are all sorts of interesting things can be done, but I think especially when we're talking about operational issues and something like a port, both the cost and the safety issues involved. And there are also things about an OT hack that create, you can actually be in a situation where you can no longer trust your field equipment. And there are thousands of these PLCs and devices out there. And can it's one thing to, wipe and reload computers, but to get out to those devices and not be sure that you can trust them could just really cripple a port for an even longer period of time.
Yeah, I think the worst thing a bad actor can do is kind of twofold. It's operation obfuscation, where your operators aren't able to communicate directly with their devices in their environment, the OT environment. And that's kind of what we've seen with ransomware, but also wiperware, as like a NotPetya case. But a follow-on to that is what we call like post-compromise events or second impact events, where your threat actor might be in your environment, in your IT environment, for instance, and they're in there, and your security teams do not know how long they've been in that environment, and then they can actually start creating persistence and then looking for more ways to compromise your environment, like using ransomware as a post-compromise event. And ports, with the amount of IoT, that's, in my opinion, the most damaging area, that if you want to compromise the port facilities, you don't even have to touch OT in particular if you just compromise IoT, and that's the soft spot, that's the underbelly. And we are seeing that from threat actors, both at nation-state level, APTs, but also financial crimes like Fin7, Fin6 kind of groups that we track. So, I mean, these are areas that are highly rich with data, but also when you have a company that is very strict on maximal tolerable downtime, if you hit that with ransomware, they may more be willing to pay ransom than actually try and solve and remediate the problem. So that's where the threat actor tries to maximize success, and so that's where I look at it.
All right, thank you, sir. So for my answer on that, so back, Arizona hosted Super Bowl 49, and I got to sit on the security group that looked at both physical and cybersecurity. So we got together with the NFL, and we asked this question, and they asked this question of us, and they said, well, Mike, what would you do? And being as convoluted as I am, I said, well, similar to what Ryan was saying, I'd hack into the HVAC systems in the hotels where the players are staying. I'd cause the alarms to go out, and when they evacuate the hotels, I'd have an active shooter pick them off one by one. You should have seen the jaws drop on the NFL. They're like, we had never thought of that. So long story short, they actually started being very quiet about where the players were staying in Arizona just because of that. So it was an interesting tabletop exercise. So moving on here, so I broke this up into kind of three areas, kind of what is the threat, what are the concerns, and then what does the future look like? So let's continue on with this, this threat thing. Let's go back to Reiner. Between now and 2025, what does the threat landscape look like for ports or maritime industry as a whole?
Murky. My biggest concern is about tech diffusion, especially with what tools, tactics, and techniques we're seeing from threat actors, and how they're able to apply what was traditionally, malware in the IT realm to operational environments. And in particular, I look at things like how could a banking Trojan be used and leveraged against a maritime facility? And not necessarily using it for banking purposes, but being able to create persistence and lateral movement in an environment. And then using that banking Trojan, deploying in a post-compromise event ransomware. And we're seeing in just the last 3 years, threat actors of a non-nation state level doing that at port facilities, at aviation, and we're currently collecting on that for our data set that I've developed at University of Maryland of seeing what kind of compromises are most affecting these types of sectors. And I think between now and 2025, we're only going to see that more, and it's not necessarily a nation state like Russia, Iran, or China doing it. It's going to be smaller, more nimble threat actor groups, financial groups, because they see these as rich environments, and they're going to continue doing that. So,
good, thank you. So Rick, how does ICSOT, so again, throwing out three-letter acronyms, which you like, which basically OT is operational technology versus informational technology. So how does ICSOT cybersecurity different from IT cybersecurity, and why should the ports care?
Well, great. Yeah, there are a couple different aspects of that. And actually, I was glad to hear Reiner talk a little bit about using the terms IoT and OT differently. I'm going to take 1 second and give you just my perspective on that in a very, very layman's way, which is, I think, and I know some other people in the field are trying to sort of promote this same thinking, just to avoid confusion, because a lot of people confuse those two terms. And what we're starting more and more, and on certain cybersecurity groups in the transportation field, are trying to use the terms IoT is the cool new stuff you see all the time on your phones and apps in your refrigerator and all these things that now are internet connected new devices. And there are a huge number of threat vectors there, but at the very least, they're being designed now, and there's some cyber thought going into those. OT generally, and there's overlap here, but OT generally, and simple way maybe is older technology usually, and these are these PLCs and other, they go by many different names, PLCs at their core that drive physical actions, and they're all over a port or, every street corner where the traffic light has these things. And the real danger there is the underlying design is from the 1980s, and they've gotten more and more capable, but they haven't gotten any more secure for the most part, and they are hugely vulnerable to take over, both as a vector in and as a point of impact. So just to lay that out there as a terminology thing, please feel free to disagree, but trying to just really simplify for people the difference between IoT and OT. Sorry, that was a little preamble. There are a large number of things that differ both from a technology point of view. You can't really take IT solutions and just slap them in an OT environment. They really won't work, and they'll be generally way more expensive and both to deploy and maintain than trying to address it, as OT. It's one of the mistakes we see quite a bit. Hey, let's throw firewalls at it. Firewalls are great devices, and they will help a little, but that sort of thing. So you need to think of it as a different environment and treat it differently. And also, there are huge psychological differences. If you want to get something done, on a port, and you go to the operations people as the IT expert, you're going to face a huge amount of resistance, we find, because they have a great deal of fear about, you're going to do things that impact my operation. And one of the things we found is that, in the IT world, when you have convenience or, efficiency and security, appropriately these days, security is trumping operations. Now, I had to move to Outlook. No offense to Microsoft, they make a lot of great products, but I'm having to use Outlook on my iPhone now because we're a cybersecurity company and it's more secure. And I hate it. And I went to our CTO, who's an old friend of mine. We've worked together for years, and said, "Come on, please. This is really frustrating. There's all these things I don't like as much as the native application." Tough. It's more secure. Get used to it. In an operational environment, that conversation can be very different. Continued operations, continuous ongoing operations will trump security in just psychologically. So you have to, if you're going into that environment and trying to help them become more secure, you need to understand that you can't just walk in and say, you're going to change this and change that and change that, because the feedback we've gotten is, we had a consultant come in and they told us all these things we need to do and we wouldn't be able to operate the same, so we didn't do any of them. And then you haven't achieved your goals. So you have to be cognizant of the fact that an operational environment and the goals of an operational environment are very different.
So a couple things on there. What I like to say is, so IT is the stuff that protects your environment. OT is stuff that works in the critical infrastructure, as Rick said. So it's minor things like OT controls all of our prison doors on our prisons. OT controls gas valves for the gas supply in this country, and you can cause gas pressure buildup and explosions with OT gas valves. OT also protects our water supply and adding chemicals in our water supply. So just minor little things like that is what we call OT technology. So with that, Dave, as an attorney, go ahead. I was waiting for the applause. As an attorney, what potential legal liabilities do you see that face maritime facilities on the cyber front?
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, don't hold it against me. All right, so this is an interesting point. I think that often gets overlooked. I find a lot of folks out there now that they're sort of like, okay, well, what's either the business case or what's the requirement that drives a lot of decision making on how much activity are we actually and resources are we actually going to put toward protecting ourselves on the cyber front. And one of the things I would tell the folks up in the C-suite that's a very real issue for them to consider, and that is, if you're a facility operator, you could not be more in the middle of the supply chain if you tried, right? You have absolutely upstream and downstream customers. So at the end of the day, if you are attacked on the cyber front and it causes a service disruption, and say it's a persistent service disruption, you could ask Maersk about that. It gets very expensive very quickly. And so what happens is you're the one, if you did not do your due diligence and really take cyber seriously, I'd say you'd wind up in court and people are looking for damages above you and below you because you either couldn't take their product or you couldn't deliver their product on time. So now it's not only the damages that occurred at your facility per se, but now you're adding to that the expense of all the people who you could not deliver on your contracts. And for, we're talking about real money. I throw Maersk out there not to throw them under the bus, but they're a great example in the sense that they were not even the target of the attack. And now here they sit, they had 850 tractor trailers sitting on I-95 in New Jersey and trying to figure out how to do that. And they had to go back and do it all by hand while they reconstituted their cargo systems. So, that for them got to be very expensive. We're in the hundreds of millions of dollars now. And by the way, they're their cyber insurance did not cover it because they considered it an act of war. So so they're eating all of that cost. So I would say that that's something very serious conversation, that if you provide cyber services at your facility, that you need to make sure that your leadership has a really good, firm understanding of what all the potential consequences are if your operations are shut down due to a cyber attack.
All right, thank you. One other comment. Rick mentioned, so you were told the iPhones are the most secure, and this is a great way to go. And the iPhone's an excellent product. Droids are an excellent product. The point is, anything that connects to the internet, anything electronic, is hackable, period. If you go to Black Hat, the iPhones are the first devices hacked. So, we all live in this false sense of reality, of thinking that, device A is better than device B. And when it comes to hacking, it's not. There's no difference in these devices. So just kind of FYI on that. So Dave, back to you. Looking at concerns of today, U.S. port facilities have had to comply with Maritime Transportation Security Act regulations since 2003. And of course, that's a high bar, right? So, which have traditionally been viewed as physical security regulations. How does the addition of cyber impact the facility's assessment of their security vulnerabilities?
Yeah, I think we touched on it a little bit about talking about IT and OT. Let's start with the idea, first of all, that when in the midst of regulations, if you look in there, you won't find the word cyber anywhere. But the Coast Guard has been pretty vocal as of late, and they have come out and said that they view cyber as being part of the midst of regulations. If that's truly the case, and I think you should treat it that way, what used to be, those regs were considered physical security. And so if you can picture, you had a fence, you had a restricted area, you had a secure area, you had a facility security officer who knew that area was very defined, and it was all inside the gate. And so, all the facility security assessments and planning and all that was all inside the gate. It was very understandable. When you add cyber to that equation, you are now connected with a bunch of stuff outside that gate, outside that fence. So what the facility security officer still owns the responsibility for assessing and planning for all of that, but now they're going to be looking at, they should be looking at, are you connected to a business enterprise somewhere outside the gate? What are you talking to that's now outside that restricted area? And so a facility security officer can no longer on their own, if we're adding cyber, truly do an assessment of security at their facility. You now have to have the conversation. You got to bring in operational technology people, IT people, operations people to say, tell me what the most important things are that are happening here, and then tell me what they're connected to. How could somebody speak to those things along, as we've been talking about the operational technology front? That's a very different way of thinking about things. But it doesn't change the fact that facility security officer still owns that plan and is responsible for addressing those issues. And that's the only way they can know it. They have to start having those conversations. I think that the folks that have been in the business for a while would say 10 years ago, IT and OT people never talked to each other, and that has to change. And that so we really need to start having those conversations. If you're not having those conversations at your facilities, you really need to start pulling all those people into the same room and beginning that conversation.
Yeah, and that's an excellent point. What I found out coming from the other side, from the IT side, so I had devices that I could see when something tapped into my network. And so I was walking around and I'm like, what the hell's this device? And here the OT guy said, well, we hooked the elevators up to the network because they need to communicate with the internet now. Seriously? You hooked your elevators to my IT network, which is our payment processing network that processes billions of dollars for the state of Arizona. Really? Is that what you did? So anyway, that's an excellent point, that you got to get everybody talking, and we got to use best practices of isolating networks so that one side can't attack the other. That's the whole target breach. So, Reiner, over to you. What are some indicators that signal to us that IoT devices may be a liability rather than an improvement for port operations?
Yeah, so again, it's kind of echoing on, the distinction between OT and then we go into IT, Internet of Things. IoT devices, they cannot withstand, you can't put a cybersecurity compliance regime in these devices. They just cannot handle that. And it's sort of how I look at OT, IoT are kind of very similar in the sense of they're insecure by design in a lot of these issues. Because in OT you have an environment where they need to just process one thing and one thing only, and it's very kind of like the introvert versus the extrovert. They're just like, I can only receive some type of data in this type of way. IT is very different. It's very much an extrovert. IoT is supposed to be kind of that interlocutor, that, in between that. But they're not in compliance with what you have with IT products, and they're not necessarily the same as what you're seeing in the OT environment. And when you have your plant managers, plant engineers saying like, well, I need to increase efficiency and I need to understand what is actually happening in my environment, but now I have to have this device secured. Your IT people, or I would say even further up, finance folks would be like, well, can't we run compliance on these IoT devices? And they'd be like, no, because like a more technical example, you can't do whitelisting commands on some IoT devices like you can do in an IT product. And because the strain of the actual product can't handle it. And so you're kind of at an impasse. And when you're deploying IoT over all your environment, both in the IT environment and the OT environment, you're increasing your risk, and actors will thrive on that. And that's where I'm kind of seeing the issue with IoT as a liability, because we're not taking security as a greater concern there. And just applying principles we've seen in another domain like IT and slapping it on doesn't work.
So are you telling me that IoT devices don't have a patch Tuesday like Microsoft does? Is that what you're trying to say?
Yes.
So take heed, all of you with Ring doorbells and those little Nest thermostats and the smart TVs. Pay attention to what Reiner just said. All right, so moving on, Rick, how does cybersecurity visibility and awareness differ from cybersecurity protection?
No, thanks. First of all, I love the introvert extrovert thing. I'm going to steal that. Yeah. Those PLCs, it's always the quiet ones, that get you, right? The little things you're not thinking about. So I'm definitely going to steal that. What was the question again? It was the visibility versus
awareness versus protection.
Yeah, and you've just given a perfect example. Awareness is
you like
very
to stray.
important.
You like to go all over the
Yeah,
place.
I do. Awareness. You gave a perfect example of awareness, becoming aware of your elevators being connected that you weren't aware of before, and you're really good at your job, obviously. And here you were with a vulnerability you luckily came across and diligently, but that was going on for some time. And so awareness is absolutely key. And when we work with people and put our version of a OT, an IDS for OT in place, they're always stunned at what we find is communicating with the outside world and devices on their network communicating each other that they didn't think were communicating with each other, and communicating with their vendors, who made that device when they didn't think that was allowed. I mean, it's amazing the traffic that goes on there. So that's absolutely key to finding out what's communicating internally and externally. And we come across people who think that they're air-gapped, and that's almost never true. And even where it's close to true, one thing we find is they make a mistake then of. Sorry, I love to jump off other people's stuff, but the fence analogy is great too. We built this great fence or outer wall or whatever. I was giving a presentation in London back in September, and I had to talk about a perfect opportunity. I'm speaking about defense in depth, and I realize I can point out the window at the Tower of London, which, by the way, I'm even a history buff. It's not a tower; it's a fort on the Thames. And I was able to, this is perfect, defense in depth. You have, an open field, you have an outer wall. They don't actually have a moat, but, all these layers all the way back to the keep, like we've all learned about with Game of Thrones and everything, that you can, or Lord of the Rings, you can retreat back, you want to have that defense all over the place. So, because things will get in, they will inevitably get in. So moving back to the awareness versus security, what we find too often, and this is another terminology issue, we'll come across people who say, oh, we have cyber defense in place. whether it's IT or OT. And what they really have is cyber visibility, cyber awareness. It's almost like the Geico commercial. I'm not a bank guard, I'm a bank monitor. Hey, you're being robbed. Well, unfortunately, in the cyber world, at the point at which you know you have a problem, you very likely have already been compromised. So, it's not a ongoing process. These things are usually scripts that happen all at once. So what we'd really recommend is moving beyond just awareness and not treating awareness itself as protection, and actually having protection down through the Purdue levels all the way down to level 0 if possible. And that's our focus, to actually interdict and stop hacks all the way down to even below the PLC level. And that's absolutely key. So don't take cyber awareness, which is important and definitely needs to be part of your strategy, as full cyber protection.
Good. Thanks, sir. All right, back to you, Dave. While some individual facilities are taking steps to address their cyber vulnerabilities, how should the port as a whole address cyber risk?
Right. So, the one thing about ports is they're a community, and just like any other community, you're only as strong as your weakest link. And so, they're very, I think terminal operators need to have the understanding that we're all really relying on each other, and that if any one of us suffers a serious attack that either causes an explosion, spill, whatever, could shut down an entire port facility, and then that becomes an issue for everyone, right? Now everybody has a service disruption. So I think to that end, and I know that the Coast Guard as well has, put out some guidance last year in the form of a navigation and vessel inspection circular, or NAVIC as they call it, and it said, hey, look in these port complexes for these captain of the ports, you need to understand cyber on a port-wide level. Well, sort of historically, the way that all of that worked, back to the MITSA regulations, was that all of these facilities would write their own facility security plans and address all their cybersecurity, their physical issues, physical security issues. And then those plans would go to area maritime security committees, and anybody in here who participates in that understands that that is the port community coming together and saying, hey, what are our issues as a whole? And so looking at those individual plans, these Coast Guard captain of the ports, or the idea being that they can go, okay, if I see all these vulnerabilities, what do they look like when I take them as a whole? So we've gotten really good since 2003 doing that on the physical security side. We're not very good at it on the cybersecurity side yet, right? It's all relatively new. But what I would say is port communities have to start looking at cyber sort of holistically. And I know I think that's a huge challenge, right? Because one, nobody wants to talk about their cyber vulnerabilities. These are publicly traded companies. Quite often, we find that to be a barrier to people having those conversations and acknowledging, what our vulnerabilities are. But there's ways you can have that conversation at a port level where I, can anonymize information or whatever. But the bottom line is, port communities have to start understanding what their key vulnerabilities are. When you consider it does matter, what type of facility I am, where I'm located in the port, and what sort of vulnerabilities do I present to that port overall. So, I think we really need to start having those conversations. I would encourage, certainly the Coast Guard to start having those conversations inside their area maritime security committees and beginning to fully understand what the holistic threat looks like.
Yep, absolutely. So for the state of Arizona, I had visibility on a little over 126,000 devices on my network. And that was a nightmare to try and manage that. I can't imagine sitting in an area where people are coming and going, and you're trying to monitor how secure are they, because the minute they come into the port, they're attaching to your networks potentially and causing vulnerabilities on your network. So kind of like running a university is my guess, right, Rainer? You got students coming in and out. You got to pay attention to students, and you got faculty, and you got a lot of protections on that side, yet the faculty want to share, right? So I'm just assuming it's a very similar problem. So now I have a question for each one of you, and that is, what threats or technology of today concerns you the most in the protection of the port? So Rainer, let's start with you.
So just quick kind of feeling there. Has anyone heard, do we know about distributed denial of service kind of issues? Have you heard of permanent denial of service? These are, I mean, again, this is kind of sticking to the IT aspect of things. But we talk about ransomware, wiperware, even the ICS malware. But a threat that I see today, and a technology that we've seen in action, and that actually does have a lot of operational damage and impact, is permanent denial of service kind of attacks. And in one particular, I was just noting up here, like we were viewing VPN filter from the Russians and how that was impacting routers across the world. One of these routers, a couple of these routers actually found themselves bricked at a water sanitation facility in Eastern Europe. And that allowed the threat actor to then manipulate chlorine levels. We were kind of like talking about this earlier. Think about what you have that in your environment at your port facilities. How many routers, just again, routers we're talking about in the IT space, do you have at your facilities? What are they connected to? Are they properly segmented? And what kind of a PDoS kind of attack would that bring down? And that's relatively simple to execute on, both as a nation-state actor, what we've seen with VPN filter, which was Russia, down to a lower level, which we've seen with, I think it was called BrickerBot, which was by a lone actor who did it as a point of, kind of a point of concept, saying, we can do this. So that's a technology and threat that I see that can be actively exploited, and we do see it. So.
Good, thank you. Rick, same question.
Again, I think one of the keys is we have to be, looking at the OT and the IT combined, and what that leads to fairly obviously is we're seeing more and more that the hacker community is starting to recognize that as we've done a good job over the last 15 or 20 years of increasing our IT cybersecurity, we actually, in a way, almost may be pushing them towards OT. I use the house analogy a lot, and we've been going around with, deadbolts and bars in the windows and alarm systems and now Ring doorbells and all this stuff, making the house more and more secure, and the garage is open. And so the hackers are starting to look and say, why am I going to stand under your brightly lit, porch, trying to hack through your front door, get through your front door, get to the security system and turn it off, and I'll go in through the garage. And it's incredibly easy to do. And the thing to remember, the jewel thief doesn't need to come in through the bedroom window. They want to get in the structure, and then they can go where they want. And it may be that they're coming in to go, your OT to get to your IT, or they may be coming to your IT to attack your OT. So we have to start looking at that really more holistically, because the hackers are getting much more creative. One of our guys on a project for a East Coast Department of Transportation, one of our sharpest hackers lives in Bismarck, North Dakota. And from his couch in Bismarck, he was able to find a cellular signal to a rural traffic signal, and able to fool the traffic controller in that box that he was the statewide network. So it let him load an update. And that update gave him full control of everything. And then he studied that traffic. And the next day he came back and was able to write a script that made him look like the controller going up to the statewide network. And in a few hours each afternoon over 2 days, he suddenly had the entire statewide traffic network on his laptop on his couch in Bismarck, from halfway across the country. That was insanely easy to do. So when you just look at that scope, and luckily he's a good guy, and reported it. Matter of fact, we were a little nervous going to the customer because we're almost like, that happened awfully fast. Normally with somebody's sort of one of our guys is going deeper and deeper, we sort of warn the customer, hey, we're doing this, now we're going to do this, they've told us to probe the live network. And this was like, oh, damn, we went from 0 to 150 in a hurry there, but it was that easy. We recently had a guy, he looked at his watch and, basically started a timer when he put his foot on the deck of a ship off the coast of Brazil, and in 23 minutes he had control of the entire vessel, all the operational controls. So that's the key thing, is recognizing that as the hackers start to apply themselves in this field, there's a lot they can do. So we really need to have to start playing defense, and there are going to have to be some changes in mindset. And we've talked a little about thinking of it as infrastructure. Your cyber is part of your infrastructure, not something you add on after the fact. You don't build a bridge, pour the concrete and say, and we'll decide later whether we want to add the rebar to make it stronger. It needs to be thought of in everything you're doing, is your cyber defense being built in. And if that one thing will have the biggest impact on being able to protect ourselves.
Yeah, now in fairness, in North Dakota, you don't go outside anyway, so you had nothing else to do. But yeah, no offense to anybody from North Dakota, but to Rick's point, this happens in warm weather as well, right? So I believe it was 2018 here in up in Dallas. A guy got into the tornado siren system and launched off 137 tornado sirens at 1 in the morning. So, this can happen anywhere. So, good point. Dave, same question.
Yeah. So when you stop and think about it, marine terminals are very unique. Let's face it, maritime trade is an ancient trade, right? And consequently, so many of these marine terminals now are 50 plus years old, many more, much older than that even. And they've been adding equipment since, all those years. So they're literally Frankenstein now. They got some stuff from very old to very new. With different capabilities, but one thing's for certain, that in the modern age, digitalization drives efficiency. You can't deny it. So you're taking a bunch of equipment. So I don't know how many of you are familiar with digital twins. That's one example of, so for predictive maintenance, we learned a while back that it's much easier if I monitor equipment 24 hours a day. I can predict when it's going to fail or when it's going to need some repairs, much better than the days when an engineer walked around and based on many years of experience say, well, that bearing sounds like it's getting ready to go out. That doesn't work anymore. So I'm going to add a bunch of digital equipment to monitor all of that, and most of it's wireless. And so I'm adding all of these things on the OT side that are communicating through IT. And so now I'm offering a bunch of new endpoints to the bad guy, so I can see what's going on at your facility if I hack in. And I don't know that every time that these digital devices are being installed that full attention is being paid to what are they connected to, and who can hop into my system now and see things and manipulate things. So I just think it's that unique nature. And again, you're not going to be able to avoid digitalization. You're not going to be able to avoid the efficiencies that it provides, but when you're installing it, be very careful about how you do that. So I think that's a huge emerging threat.
I thoroughly agree. So the analogy for Dave's point that I have is State of Arizona is a $9 billion organization, 48,000 employees, 133 agencies, boards, and commissions. When vendors came to me, I used to say, I have one of everything. I just am not sure where it is or who's running it. And that's literally how I felt sometimes is, to Dave's point, people are constantly hooking stuff up, and you can't possibly keep track of every little thing. So with that, let's move the conversation into the future now. So Dave, let's go back to you. What recommendations do you have for facilities that are wanting to take steps to reduce their cyber vulnerability?
The biggest challenge, I think, bar none, is management of change. Management of change is a very difficult thing outside the digital realm. But how many facility operators out there, you have so many vendors, third-party vendors, that you need to maintain and keep things running at your facility, many of whom you grant admin access to because they're going to come in the middle of the night and do a firmware update that you never even knew that they touched your footprint, or you may not even remember that you gave them permission to do that. So the real challenge on the digital front is how do I control that, right? Does my facility, for example, do I have a policy for management of change, in my, my ISM code, however you track management of change. If you don't have that, I would highly encourage you to take a look at that and consider how you're granting access, whether it's physical or digital, to vendors that are coming to your site and manipulating your system. And that goes as well, too. Somebody talked yesterday about insider threat. What protections am I putting in place so that I would see that if I had an insider threat, that people that are changing things on my system, that I see it and I know it, and I have exercising some control over it. It's not an easy answer, but you can't ignore it, right?
Right, absolutely. Rick, would it help the industry if the industry started to view cybersecurity as a part of infrastructure and not something that you add later, and you kind of alluded to this.
Yeah. To me, I think, from a mindset point of view, this is the closest thing to, I think, a silver bullet in moving forward.
Is there a silver bullet?
Well, I mean, it's a huge step in the right direction. Too much, far too often we go into situations and, these systems have evolved and evolved and evolved. And I use a Frankenstein, analogy sometimes too, that it's now, this system that has been evolving since the 80s of putting, having this operational technology have less and less human element. We really have built a Frankenstein's monster, and it's now ready to get up off the slab and cause us a lot of problems if we don't control it well. And a key element is to start thinking about cybersecurity as part of your infrastructure. And Reiner's made a great point that most of these devices, they can't run their own cyber defense. They're in the perfect negative sweet spot. These devices are smart enough that they can be hacked. They've got enough capability that a hacker has the tools inherent in that device now to manipulate it and get it to do what he wants it to do, he or she wants it to do. But does not have enough onboard capability to run its own defense. So my laptop is vulnerable, but my laptop can also have defense on it. My servers can, this and that. Those PLCs cannot. So what we look at is you really need to build an envelope of cybersecurity around those things. And in a way that's a positive, because you may swap out vendors and swap out equipment and everything, but if you're putting it back in that same cybersecure envelope, then you can have confidence of that. And then moving into this whole infrastructure idea, I mean, just to give you one analogy, we were working with a city who was, working with us as a leader to try to put in cybersecurity for their traffic system, and we're thrilled with them. And one day he introduces me to his consultants who's helping with another project, and he says, and Dean, after we do the $35 million upgrade of everything, we should come back and do an RFP to buy Rick's stuff for the whole system, within the next year or so after that. And the consultant talked to me a little bit and went back to his customer and said, why would we do that? Just put Rick's requirements in the $35 million project, and now we do our build out with cybersecurity already in it. And that's a great example, and that just got awarded recently. So, it's going to be inherent to the system. That's the kind of thinking that and this guy it's funny because the guy who made the initial mistake is one of the most forward thinkers I've met in the transportation field. And still he was thinking infrastructure, then cybersecurity, not cybersecurity being part of the infrastructure. I think that's just a key change in the paradigm that everybody at a port needs to be making, everybody in a shipping company, everybody, is to try to look at this needs to be part of the build out, not something you patch on later. So.
Absolutely, I agree. My analogy for that is, so in the savannah of life, where you have cheetahs and lions running all around, you want to be the fastest gazelle, not the slowest gazelle. So you want to put layered security in place to get the cheetahs and lions to go after somebody else. So.
And one thing we use all the time is, you don't have to be the fastest gazelle, but you really don't want to be the slowest one.
Just faster in Mississippi.
I actually had fun with that. That city that I just talked about, they asked me to give a presentation to a regional group. And I just always throw in a line about, something about outrunning the bear, right? You don't have to outrun the bear, you just have to outrun the other hiker. And, old joke. And I actually use the, you don't have to outrun as X city, and I shouldn't name them, but, as X, you don't have to outrun the bear, you just have to outrun Orlando. And as I'm packing up my materials at the end, this guy comes up and says, "Hi, my name's Kevin. I'm from Orlando. I guess we're going to need to talk to you now because, now we're going to be the slowest gazelle." So, you definitely want to keep moving the bar and not be the easiest target. Yeah.
Yeah, and I probably should say that now that as part of this panel, all of us in the panel are in agreement that please don't take offense to our comments, that we're not making it personal. So, all right, Reiner, what will be the threat actors of most concern for ports in 2030? And please tell me it's not the Canadians.
It is not our friendly neighbors to the north, no. Probably, it really has weighed on me, like with this question, because it is really split between two actors, and one is China, because of its focus on collecting information in these environments. So their focus may not be criminal in the sense of cybercrime or destructive, if we've seen, but it's espionage. And ports offer a lot of are very rich environments, and these are areas that I think are very concerned because, you know, it's where you have transportation, logistics, you have financial information from your competitors, all this coming through at your ports, and China really wants to get into that kind of data-rich environment and persist and stay in those environments. And I think that's a threat actor that really needs to be taken a hard look at with regards to this. I mean, I automatically think of Belt and Road Initiative folks that have signed on and what they're actually getting themselves into, especially some of our partners in Europe. You know, what kind of threat they are facing from a very advanced espionage. And that's, I think, the biggest concern. But I also look at cybercrime, and I see the evolution of tools and techniques and our procedures that we're seeing, the TTPs, from financially motivated groups that have moved, as we've seen like with ransomware, how it used to be kind of like this scattershot thing. Now it's very targeted, and you're seeing these environments, especially in ports, and I've seen in the aviation facilities as well. You know, these are rich environments, and they want to continue going after them because the more information that we store in these areas, the more connectivity we have, the bigger the target for them. And so I see that as more like a criminal kind of financial aspect as a threat. But priority is definitely China.
Awesome, thank you. So now let's go to a question here for each one of you. So now we've kind of gone through, you know, what's the threat, what are our concerns, and what's coming up in the future. So now knowing more than we knew when we started this conversation, my question for all of you is, how would you use cyber to cause kinetic effects in the port? And I'll start with you, Dave.
Yeah, I think, you know, certainly we've alluded to it. So, you know, to bear in mind, you know, what and I keep going back to the MITSA regulations because that's really what is driving a lot of the activity now on the cyber front for these facilities. You know, and what the Coast Guard requires that you protect against is something called a transportation security incident. And a transportation security incident is defined as service disruption, loss of life, major spill, you know, anything that would really interrupt activity in the port. So when you think about it in those terms, what you're, you know, sort of the requirement that you protect against is something that's necessarily going to almost certainly have to get to the operational technology side of the house. And so, you know, I, as we've been talking about up here, you know, I think that facility operators really need to take a hard look at their operational technology because that's going to be the threat vector. That's how the bad guy wants to get in and manipulate something, either turn a valve or overpressurize something or do whatever. And they're going to have to do that on the operational technology side. So, you know, we talked a little bit too, the challenge in that is that, and why IT people and OT people historically have not spoken to each other a whole lot. And that's because on the IT side of the house, information is king, right? Data is king. As long as you don't get to my data or manipulate my data or steal my data, I'm doing my job, right? On the operational technology side of the house, my job is to keep that equipment running. If somebody breaks in and they steal the payroll or the social security numbers, yeah, that's a bad day, but the facility didn't shut down, and that's what I care about, right? So you have to balance those two concerns. I think probably, you know, we're evolving to the point now though where more concern has to be had toward that connectivity, that middle ground. We really have to understand that. We have to make it a point to understand that. And, you know, as I mentioned earlier, I think the only way that happens is putting the right people in the room and having the right conversation about what's connected to what and what are the potential outputs, you know, on a physical side because of that.
Good, thanks. Rick, same question.
Yeah, well, I mean, and I'll admit, I don't have yet, though we're having some very interesting early port discussions, I don't have as much experience in the port field as I'd like, but we have done a lot in ground transportation, with departments of transportation, and with maritime. So really, the ports are the next natural. It's where they come together. But just in our initial work, I was talking with one fairly large port, and I think the number was something like, I'm not getting exactly, I think they said 132 different operational systems that they had identified, and some of those, the risks may be fairly minor, but you have everything from things you can do that would be horrible, like on a ship. I mean, you can shift all the ballast, you can spoof the GPS, you can control the engines and the steering and everything. So obviously, you could do things with the ships in a port that could be incredibly dangerous. The actual port equipment, certainly you could do a lot of things that might be physically dangerous with cranes and all this other heavy moving equipment that's on a port and is mostly automated now. But also just from a crippling point of view, to just create trust. If you took over one crane and had it swing wildly on a port, now can you trust any of the other? You pretty much have to shut down your entire operation, because even though the hacker may have only taken over one, well, if they could take over one, then 5 minutes from now, they could take over 5 more or 10 more. So that would be a big part of it. I mean, we always start with looking at potential loss of life first, but just things that can just cause you to not trust your own environment. And from a commerce point of view, that could be incredible.
Yeah, agree. Reiner?
Yeah, so I'm a big fan of Greek mythology and so forth, and one of the things I think about also is safety instrument systems, and I consider that Atlas holding up the world, but it's Atlas with Achilles' heel. And safety instrument systems, those really are your last line of defense in these environments, and of particular note is if you can interrupt that process, then the system that you have, because once you activate system instrument systems and there is something wrong, then you're going to have a kinetic effect of some sort, right? So one area that I found very interesting, and this is a case that I came across similar to Triton Trisis that some people might know about, is that operators in a plant in Eastern Europe had this issue with NotPetya, and so they said operational obfuscation, as I mentioned earlier, was a concern. So as part of their policy, they said if we have any type of operational obfuscation where we cannot see what's going on, we will actually activate system instrument systems as a run-through. So they could see, all right, if we're having an incident, even on the IT side, we're going to go to this. Actors like Russia will want you to do that because they will be able to use Triton Trisis type malware. They will use ransomware in conjunction with that to bring you down to that state. So if you have ransomware that is obfuscating your operations and you activate system instrument systems, taking that away from what we call the basic control process systems, the regular run-through, and that is compromised, you will have a kinetic effect. There will be a problem. And there are cases where I wish I could talk about concrete cases, but NDAs I can't talk about. And that's a main concern because they are really the last line of defense, but they have this Achilles heel to that, right? And there is malware out there, but which we can see and has been reverse engineered because of Triton Trisis, where you're affecting the system. And there's always the concern with, how many vendors out there are able in their supply chain to patch and secure this before it goes out to their customers. Again, you think Schneider Electric, Siemens, who, right? Like how many of them actually develop these products and how far along in this supply chain can that be infiltrated and then uploaded that way versus what we saw in Triton Trisis, which was actually at the event. So that's my big concern for like a kinetic effect.
Excellent, thank you. So my concern in that area right now, I've been doing a lot with looking at drones. We've seen a lot of activity with drones with Saudi Aramco and launching explosions over oil supplies, causing lots of damage. We've seen drones go after leaders in countries down in, I think it was Argentina, if I remember, or one of the South American countries. So if it were me, I'd take drones in a couple of different ways. And to Reiner's point, it depends on what do you want to do? What do you want to cause? Do you want a financial loss? Do you want a kinetic? Do you want some damage to happen? So I'd look at drones and utilizing explosives, but I could also look at drones and utilizing going after Wi-Fi networks to do what Dave and Reiner were talking about. I can attach a little device called a pineapple on a drone, and basically it'll go around and say, hey, I'm your wireless network, attached to me. And I can get all these little devices that Dave and Reiner were talking about, control of the ship, the gas release valves, things like that, and get them to attach to my drone, pretend it's my network. Now I'm the man in the middle and I can control those devices. I just got some questions launched at me just last week about EMPs, and is there a way you could attach some sort of EMP, which electronic pulse device, on a drone, which would cause disruption of all electronic devices? I don't know the answer to that. If somebody does, I'd be interested. But there's all kinds of little things like that that I think would cause kinetic effects. Losing control of the ship is a big one. I know they don't come into port at full speed, but certainly if they're not under control, they could slam into another ship or slam into port, and depending if there's oil or what gas or whatever is on that ship, it could cause a lot of damage. It could shut down the port indefinitely if the ship sinks, for a long period of time anyway, if the ship sinks. So that's kind of what I would do. So I'm coming to you guys next. We got about 15 minutes left. I'm going to ask you for your questions. So I'm going to give you a little background on DHS. Now that what I call the good news fairies here kind of gave you all the things to be afraid of, today I'm going to talk about a few things that we can do. So how can you help yourself? Because I don't like to just come and scare the hell out of everybody and say, have a nice day and a nice safe trip home. So I want to give you a little things that you can do to protect your organization. And I'm going to come to you for questions for this panel to play our little game of Stump the Panel. So first of all, DHS responds to the national critical infrastructure. That's the 16 critical sectors identified by President Bush after 9/11. I'm very confident all of you are part of the critical infrastructure in this room. Our services are no cost, or again, no cost after you file that form on April 15th. There's no additional cost to you or your company for DHS to come in and provide services. We do everything from pen testing to vulnerability assessments to red team hunting to our coolest service is called a Vader. It's just cool to say, hey, I had a Vader from DHS. It's actually an architectural design. They'll come in, review, and they'll come in and look at your network and look at how you're segmenting your network and let you know what's vulnerable, what's not, what's a good idea, what's not, those types of things. We do everything from cyber hygiene scanning, web scanning, phishing, table talks, and then the CSAs ourselves, we conduct cyber maturity models called cyber resilience reviews or infrastructure surveys based on the NIST cybersecurity framework. And we also do supply chain management, looking at your supply chain. How can your supply chain affect your organization? If you're interested in any of these, please just ping me. I'll put you in touch. Again, if you're in the Houston area, George Reeves is your CSA. If you're outside of Houston, it might be Chad up in Dallas or myself in Phoenix, depending on where you are in the country. But just ping me and say, hey, I saw you at the Port of the Future, and who's my DHS guy in my area? And my email is easy. I apologize. I was going to get a slide, but you see my name up there. It's michael.letman@hq.dhs.gov. Pretty easy. So just add it on there. So with that, DHS also does incident response. We have a whole thing on Iran. If you go to CISA.gov/Iran, there's a whole briefing on Iran, which is, I think, very good. If you're interested in that whole geopolitical issues. We have cyber essentials that you can use, and as mentioned earlier, we're really dealing a lot with the elections right now. So there are a lot of good companies out there that can do this exact same stuff for you. It's not just DHS. You shouldn't just do it because DHS is free. There's going to be a time wait. You think about it. If there's every critical infrastructure across the country wants to do something for free, there's no way we're going to be able to respond to that. So we're going to have a lot of good private sector companies help us in that. But this is a starting point, especially for some organizations that are limited in resources and limited in funds right now. So that's 2 cents on DHS and what do we do. So with that, I want to turn it over to you guys and field questions from you guys. Oh, and you are texting them in right now. So how often are you doing internal tests with your staff to ensure they aren't operating bad emails? When you guys want to grab that?
So I'll take that one on a little bit.
Okay.
So what I would tell you is, beyond some of the things we talked about on the IT/OT interface, probably the single biggest threat out there is social engineering, right? People are the weak link. It's just the way it is. It's the way it's probably always going to be. So in answer to the question, I think I'd be testing my staff probably pretty much continuously, to see if they respond to phishing emails and things like that. So when we would go, if we do an assessment of a vessel or facility, every time, the cyber solution is going to be an elephant, right? And, we're going to tell you your baby's ugly, and they know that before we even start. But critical to that is you need to do the assessment and develop a roadmap. I'm talking a 3 to 5 year roadmap so you can budget for it and start making changes. And one of the things I would tell everybody always, the low hanging fruit, it's really not that expensive and not that huge a lift, is training your people. I just, take it seriously, train your people constantly and test them. To this day, you'd think, okay, everybody knows now to watch out for the phishing emails and all that, and yet things like Maersk, were started with a phishing email. So you can't presume that people are getting the message fully all the time, so just keep driving it home.
Excellent. I'm going to jump to number 3 there. First of all, thank you for whoever that was out there. He says, by the way, he or she says, by the way, the drone attack was Venezuela, and Israel tested a UAV-borne EM device. So those are the answers to those 2 things. And then the question is, are you aware of any historic cyber red team exercises against Harbor? I'll start with that. Yes, DHS has conducted those. That's one of the assessments that I mentioned. I can't say which harbors or whatever, but if you are a harbor and you're interested in that, please get a hold of DHS. There's also a lot of excellent private companies that do the exact same thing, and I know they have done that for harbors around the country as well. Anybody else? Any knowledge from you guys on?
We will probably be doing some soon, but
Yeah.
we haven't done. But we've done both. As I said, both the shipping side and the ground transportation side, which are both key elements of the harbor. So the parallels would exist, but we're in some discussions about doing some harbor work soon. So
I thought you were. That's why I teed it over to you. All right, and then next question here. How well known is the NIST cybersecurity framework in the maritime world and the willingness of the industry to adopt it? Anybody want to grab that?
Yeah, well, I'll just make one comment on that. We do find if somebody says, I want to make sure I am, it's almost always NIST that they bring up, and that's great. And that's part of our process is to do that. The one comment I'll make, there's a guy in our company, he's actually one of the founders and VPs of the company. He's this big teddy bear of a guy, completely lovable. But once in a while, he really pisses people off. And one of the things that he does that edges on that is if the phrase stands alone, he can get in trouble. But it's something he likes to say, and it's deadly accurate, is compliance is not security. Compliance is a step on the way. Problem is he says that first part, and he doesn't always follow through it, and people overreact. Nice day. Compliance is incredibly important, and you should absolutely do it. But in the cyber world, things are deeper and move faster than you ever. Whatever you think however deep you think they are, and however fast they move, it's already deeper and faster. And so compliance is great, and compliance moves you in the right direction, but you need to go beyond compliance and challenge yourself with the questions, whether internally or by getting vendors to challenge you or DHS to challenge you, to think about the things that go beyond what NIST has already thought of. It's a huge help. It'll move you in the right direction, but you need to go beyond that. So yes, NIST is key, but you got to go further than that.
Yeah, I'd like to weigh in a little bit on that. So, well, first of all, I think the NIST cybersecurity framework is an excellent framework. I mean, if you're looking at a framework that has 23 categories and 108 subcategories of outcomes, that's pretty thorough. And it was developed pulling together a lot of thought leadership over many years. The great thing about it is one of the struggles that governments have going forward is cybersecurity can never be prescriptive, right? So a framework like NIST CSF is perfect for that. It's outcome-based. You just try to achieve the outcomes, but if you're achieving all the outcomes, you're doing probably a really good job. I'd say you can always go deeper. I agree with that for sure. The other thing I would say to that end is the U.S. Coast Guard, when they did talk about cybersecurity in a policy document in 2017, pointed to the NIST cybersecurity framework as a best practice. So here in the U.S., it's, that statement's already been made, that NIST CSF is the way to go if you're operating a maritime facility. And I think NIST CSF is also gaining a lot of traction worldwide as a very favorable way of looking at cybersecurity.
Okay, cool. I'm going to jump to number 3 here. It says, please address hacking physical access control systems to do manual attacks versus cyber attacks. Yeah, that's a very good point. So if I'm the ultimate hacker, I'm going to do something to get you to squirrel onto that cyber attack so that I can do something physical, and as a couple of panelists mentioned in our conversations, that I could just walk through the garage or walk through the window because you're not paying attention to me. So that's a very good point. Just quick, any other comment on that?
No, that's perfect.
Okay, that's what I thought you were looking at. And we got about 5 minutes left, so let's just take this one here. Knowing the cyber threat to industry and especially small business, can NIST hold a web or open class at regular intervals? My sarcastic answer is no. So here's the problem. So the federal government, you notice every time I made comments to you and I talked about my past, I said the state of Arizona, and because I can talk about my experiences, but I can't, as a member of DHS, recommend you have to do this or you should do this. The problem is there's a liability issue there. So now we have to be careful about how the U.S. government says, take all these steps and you'll be fine. And then you get hacked and you say, what the hell? That type of thing. So that's the problem. Now, are there organizations out there that do a very good job of summarizing this and the best practices? Absolutely. I developed a program at the state of Arizona where we ran through, I think it was 132 questions. NIST has 387, if I remember. So we ran through kind of the main 132, and we even got it down to, state of Massachusetts does this as well. They said, if you're doing these 32 things, you're doing at least the very basic. If you're not doing these 32 things, you're not protecting yourself. So, there's a couple of different models out there. So I would look for that. So with the last 3 minutes here, first of all, I want to take time, before I forget, thank the panel. Thank you guys very much for all your insight and your information to this group. Dave, thank you very much for your service. I want to make sure I get all that in before we go to my last question, and I'm shocking him here. I didn't tell him I was asking him this. So what I'd like to hear is some last words and advice from you guys. So I'll start so you can think about it for a second. My words of advice, if I had to leave here and leave you something with, mine are, don't act out of fear. Take proactive steps to protect yourself. It's not if you're going to be a target, it's when you're a target. So make sure you're training your staff. This is the whole philosophy of wars. Understand your enemy and know how to defend yourself against your enemy. Then you have at least a fighting chance. If you have no clue what they're going to come at you with and you don't know what their intents are, you are now at a disadvantage. So that's my thoughts out to you guys. What do you guys want to?
Yeah, I'll take that. So my advice is know what you have, right? Too many times I go out there, if I'm talking to somebody in senior leadership, a CEO, COO, and I ask them how you doing on cyber, their answer is going to be doing great. And the question is who you assign your cyber responsibilities to. It's my IT guy, right? So the real answer to the question is you really don't know what you have. You turn to your IT person and say, how are we doing? They say, we're doing great. That's not the right answer. The right answer is if you don't know specifics of that answer to that question and you're in senior leadership, you're missing the boat. So I encourage all the IT, OT people out there, people working at that level, make sure that your leadership understands what you got, right? And there's going to be vulnerabilities in there. And that's okay. There'll always be vulnerabilities, but make sure they understand, because senior leadership's all about risk. That's what they want to deal with. They want to deal with risk, and they can't deal with risk if they don't know it exists. So make sure they're very well aware of what they've got.
Okay, Rick, last thoughts, 1 minute.
Yeah, I'd say that building off of that, don't assume that the things you have built-in security. I mean, we do that to some degree with modern devices, and occasionally fairly often, that's a problem. your existing infrastructure. Do not assume that there's much of any cybersecurity inherent in that, and challenge your vendors. Make it a requirement to them. At the very least, they may have to come back to you and admit that they can't solve that problem, and now that's a starting point to work with you on solving it, rather than having your head in the sand. So, challenge the people who are putting systems on your port or any other infrastructure you run. What can I be doing? What are you doing for me already, and can you reach this standard? And if they can't, don't make it punitive, but what do we do together then to try to achieve that?
Rick, you mean to say, so my Norton comes up and says, you're secure. I shouldn't believe that?
It's actually, I think we all make assumptions about the things we touch every day that are secure. And at least in the modern IT world, there probably is some built-in inherent security. We trust it too much probably, but in the legacy infrastructure is definitely can't be trusted that way.
Reiner, last thoughts.
So this kind of thinking on risk, from the IT and OT, you have to think about it. Do you want to keep it secret? Do you want to keep it safe? Because when you look at IT, it's about secret, the confidentiality. Because there's shared, when we look at information security triad, you really do have data integrity, availability, and confidentiality. Integrity and availability are shared between OT and IT, but the difference is IT is about secrecy, OT is about safety, and understanding that, because you can't just put cybersecurity. Damn, that thing's annoying.
I got nervous. We can see the countdown up here, 5, 4, 3, and I'm like, okay,
sorry.
what's going to happen?
I was like, I have 17 seconds.
Right. So again, I want to thank my panelists up here. I want to especially thank all of you guys who are coming out 8 in the morning. God bless you. I'm glad you came out to listen to us. Thank you all very much. Have a great conference.